Indie games have an incredible uphill battle to climb, even after accounting for the fact that these are games that, more often than not, are built on shoestring budgets and limited free time. They are also games that have to rely on word of mouth to overcome their low profile, and the limitations on resources make for a market where thinking outside of the box is necessary if you want to stand tall alongside the giants of this medium. Because the truth is, you're going to be competing with a lot of games that are better marketed, have better visuals, and probably have a lot more meat to them. Since the spectrum of indie games is so broad, there's been a whole bunch of ways where developers come around as disadvantage. And while this has manifested itself in a bunch of ways, 3 points ring true the most when talking about the game we're going to take a look at today. The first is not just a convenient but also justified application of pixel art aesthetics. Pixels in games are a product of limitation, a remnant of the bygone era of bit wars and times before consoles and computers could render a lot more than just a series of densely packed squares. By a similar token, indie developers have been able to embrace the artistry and elegance of these graphics because they too are limited, not so much by technology in this case, but more so time and budget. Lab Zero, developers of Skullgirls, have gone into heavy detail about how much it costs for them to develop one character, and getting a character out within 3 months is really steep. The irony of it all is that while this is in the context of a fighting game that demands an incredible level of meticulous work, even for all of the insane amount of frames and detail that a game like Skullgirls has, it's allegedly still cheaper on average than the budget one character gets in a AAA fighting game. It's a lot of hard work, and it's a bit of a luxury that not a lot of indie developers could be lucky to afford. That isn't to say pixel art is easy to do, but when weighing the effort required to create and integrate seamlessly animated 2D artwork into a paradigm of deliberate values, against creating pixelated sprites that can conform much more easily to strict parameters, it's easy to see why pixels might be preferable towards certain indies when creating games. It also occasionally helps consolidate the fact that a few indie games will have a lot of their assets made by the same people who program them, which gives developers a lot of room to quickly improve and cut corners more easily. The limitation becomes something of an advantage as well because many of these games can sell themselves on a holistic art style that evokes nostalgic memory within the players, which is something that's become increasingly prevalent over the years, not just in games, but even movies and music. The second point in which indies have become prevalent is the rise of game jams. Having been involved with a few Ludum Dares of my own, game jams have been a great way for indies of varying groups and sizes to pump out smaller efforts and low-risk projects based around unique concepts. The way game jams usually work is giving you a short time frame, usually consisting of a few days total, to create a small game based around a certain concept pertaining to what the game jam is about. In the case of Ludum Dare, the concept is something suggested by the users and voted upon. Game jams are a great way to gather feedback on unique ideas that developers don't often take into consideration before they act upon them. It's a safe way to take a few days' time out to brainstorm concepts that they can share between each other and collect feedback upon. While many of those game jams will rate games on individual aspects like graphics and visuals, perhaps the more important part is the concept itself and how the game plays. Sometimes it can manifest into a base for something that can be a premise for a full-scale game. There's a bit of an adage that creators like to help elevate each other, and the connected nature of the indie scene makes this especially the case, whether it be a game dev tag on Twitter or a more ambitious collective such as game jam scenes. Finally, the third point is the rise of the roguelite. Between the aforementioned lack of resources and the lack of a proper platform for wider reach, indie games are at a constant battle for an audience's investment. The effort that goes into developing many of these games within a reasonable time frame means a lot of them end up somewhat short, and because of that they make it up in various ways, such as focusing on a subversive, unique story experience, or having a certain expanded hook to its gameplay. Genres like couch co-op and local multiplayer games have become a lot more prominent, but when maximizing the amount of time spent in terms of single player, one of the ways developers have managed to consolidate expanding the size and replayability of their games is by conforming to random number generation. Roguelike refers to a subgenre of RPG games that are characterized by dungeon crawling, procedurally generated levels of random drops and pickups, and also the presence of permanent death. The name stems from Rogue, a 1980 Unix-based video game that made huge waves at college campuses because of the boom in fantasy role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons. In 2008, Spelunky was released, and it was one of, if not the first major instance of an indie game that pushed itself on roguelike elements. The designer, Derek Yu, was notably a huge fan of the roguelike game Hack, but he wanted to implement the depth of those games into his favorite genre, which was platformers. 3 years later, indie game designer Edmund McMillan behind Team Meat and Super Meat Boy would collaborate with indie programmer Florian Himsel to release The Binding of Isaac. Originating as a game jam project of its own, it was a game that, much like Spelunky, also tried to capitalize on roguelike elements, but in this case it was combining it with the dungeon structure of the original Legend of Zelda. The popularity of Spelunky and Binding of Isaac would arguably revitalize the entire genre of RNG-based dungeon crawling, not just for the players but also developers, since offering short-fire bursts of levels entirely structured through chance is merely a matter of balancing a numbers game. It's built all around unpredictable design, which makes development flow fairly straightforward and invites players to revisit a game more often because not one experience is the same. Since roguelikes were traditionally only applicable to role-playing games alongside a few other specific nuances, games like Spelunky and Binding of Isaac are instead sometimes referred to as roguelike-likes, but in colloquial speaking terms, players tend to affectionately refer to them instead as roguelites. So what does perhaps the most frustratingly long preamble I've ever done in a video have to do with today's subject? Well, quite literally everything. Today we're going to take a look at what is perhaps my absolute favorite roguelite, and one of my favorite indie games. Nuclear Throne is a game developed by Dutch indie studio Vlambeer. If you're familiar with indie games, it's highly likely that these guys need little to no introduction. For the uninitiated, Vlambeer is a two-man studio consisting of programmer/designer Jan Willem Niemann and overall business/development/producer Rami Ismail. They're a developer highly known for their energetic games which have a masterful touch for game feel. They're also known for their prolific, forward-thinking mentality within the game development community, with Rami in particular being known for his extensive non-stop worldwide travels, hosting university seminars, and delivering keynotes at major game conferences like GDC. Vlambeer was founded in 2010 after the two developers dropped out from a game development course they were attending, and have since then developed games like Super Crate Box, Serious Sam the Random Encounter, and Luftrausers. Nuclear Throne originally began its life as a game jam under the title Wasteland Kings, which was so well received that the developers would later continue developing the game, taking the form of an early access game with an unprecedented community-driven push, live streaming development twice a week, encouraging fan gameplay streams, and taking into account fan feedback. In late 2015, the game finally exited early access after 2 years of development, releasing simultaneously on Vita, Steam, and PlayStation 4. As you might have already guessed, Nuclear Throne takes on the form of an incredibly fast-paced shoot-'em-up roguelite. Set in a post-apocalyptic Earth ravaged by mutants, freaks, science experiments, and bandits, you make your way through the barren wastelands with an insane arsenal of weapons, dispatching every enemy to clear a level and get to the next. You and a band of other inhabitants of the wasteland have drawn to a campfire after hearing a legend of the coveted Nuclear Throne. All of you come from different walks in life and have different motivations, but each one of you share the same goal, and that is to reach the Nuclear Throne. No one knows why or if it even exists, but come whatever may, the characters will fight on to see a light at the tunnel that is the violent wasteland. If you're entering Nuclear Throne expecting something of your standard Binding of Isaac style experience that has you carried by a spreadsheet encompassing amounts of power-ups that ease you into the seemingly overbearing experience, you're most definitely in for a rude awakening with this game. While Nuclear Throne is heavily dependent on its randomly generating maps and drops, you are always at the mercy of fast-paced micromanagement, since your main way of dispatching enemies is a vast array of weapons that share ammo pools, which are an incredibly finite resource. The guns are the perhaps most distinct element about Nuclear Throne's combat. The game has over 50 different weapons that fall into several categories. Bullet weapons have high-capacity ammunition with consistent damage output, while shell weapons have short distance but bounce off walls and do high damage up close. Bolt weapons provide increased range and high damage output but require a lot of accuracy, while explosive weapons do high area of effect damage that can destroy walls but also inflict damage on the player if they're not wary. Finally, energy weapons have lingering hitboxes to provide high damage but also soak up ammo incredibly fast. Melee weapons also exist of varying types, and some of them can actually fall into any of the aforementioned categories and consume ammo. Weapons can be obtained through red chests and sometimes through rare enemy drops. You can only carry 2 weapons at once, so it's important to be able to make compromises and decisions based off of how your ammo pool and character is managed for the run. Oh, and speaking of that, while shoot-'em-ups mixed with roguelikes isn't something that hasn't been done before, what sets Nuclear Throne apart from the rank and file at a mechanical level is its large focus on character-specific features and upgrades. Nuclear Throne has 10 playable characters, and they each have a unique gimmick about them, a passive and active ability that alters the way you play the game. Crystal, for example, is a beginner-friendly character that starts with a higher pool of health, and her active ability allows her to shield herself from projectiles for a short few seconds. Melting is a high-risk, high-reward character who starts with a much lower health pool and tends to die in one hit, but his active ability allows him to detonate enemy corpses, which won't inflict damage on himself, but also destroys enemy projectiles, and his passive has him gain more radiation than other characters. More on that later. Steroids is a character who has poor aiming, but his passive turns all weapons into automatics, and his active allows him to dual wield and fire his secondary weapon, making him exceptional at bullet-based combat. Playing as each of these characters yield a wide variety of different challenges and can be a good way to experience the game in a much more unique way, but their abilities also heavily influence what might suit best for them when it comes to leveling up. And this is where the second part of Nuclear Throne's gimmick shines the most, which is mutations. When you defeat enemies, they drop radiation pellets and chunks, which are this game's form of experience. By filling up the canister in the top left, you will level up, and leveling up provides you with a mutation. These provide you with passive upgrades that heavily help you on your quest. Trigger Fingers is one of the universally great ones, as it shortens reload times upon a kill. Rabbit Paw heavily benefits a character like Rebel, who often needs to pick up health packs so she can survive spawning minions, while Heavy Heart helps Robot tremendously, as it gives him more weapon drops to consume. But the fun doesn't stop there. Once you max out a character at level 10 is when you unlock level Ultra, where you get to choose from one of 2 Ultra mutations. This is the final mutation you get to choose on a run. They are entirely character specific, and they can turn a game into an absolute insanity. One of YV's Ultra mutations allows its active to fire an extra trigger at no cost, which becomes absolutely ridiculous if you have a weapon like the Super Plasma Cannon. But perhaps one of the most overpowered crazy mutations in the entire game is Fish's Ultra mutation Gunworn. It allows you to, for the first 7 seconds of a level, fire your weapon without the consumption of ammo. If you have a weapon on you that consumes ammo heavily, such as Super Crossbow or the aforementioned Super Plasma Cannon, it turns the level to an absolute barrage of bullets and dead corpses flying about. Ultra mutations like these are absolutely necessary in runs that involve loops, and that's where the final of this game's gimmicks comes into play. Nuclear Throne's ending proposes you with one of 2 different outcomes. You can either beat the endgame boss, or by inducing certain conditions in the boss, you can trigger a loop, which starts you at the beginning of the game again, but now the levels are overrun with even more enemies that are harder and will be even more of a threat against you. Looping is possible to do more than once, and it boosts the difficulty even more each time. Several levels get infused with brand new bosses that are hard as nails, and after a point you also start unlocking new post-loop crowns. Crowns being passive gameplay modifiers that tend to provide a risk-reward incentive. When combining all of this into a cocktail of devilish challenges such as unlocking starting crowns for characters, or unlocking each character's respective beast skin, you have a game that is already mechanically sound. But where Nuclear Throne goes the extra mile is in something I feel is a conscious dichotomy when it comes to its presentational elements, and while this is something that's most present in its visuals and audio, the same also goes for some of its mechanics. Let's do a roundup on what we're dealing with here. The entire game's graphics are illustrated by Paul Veer, a longtime collaborator of Lambeer, who's something of a veteran and legend in the pixel artist community. He's known for his vibrant, detail, and lush pixel art style that's really expressive, and he's even done collaborative work with the likes of Sega for large-scale quality prints. The sprites of Nuclear Throne are fairly small, but exude an incredible level of expression that have a somewhat playful vibe to them, but also inform so much about the characters you play and the enemies you face. On their own, the graphics are already a treat filled with energy, and if you take a simple glimpse at the game, you'd probably get the impression easily that the game is a wacky romp, which it kind of is. But then the presence of sound comes in, and that's when you ultimately realize, this game is insane. This game is hard. And it will kick your ass. Nuclear Throne, for as high energy and frenetic as it is, also ends up feeling compelling in the narrative and lore it builds of its background. The music of the game was composed by Jukio Kallio, while Jonas Turner was a sound designer. I feel like it's important to point out how both of these audible elements stand in contrast to the energetic graphics, because whatever assumptions pixel art might bring about in people, the audio of Nuclear Throne is distinctively gritty. The characters growl, spit, speak, and scream in a post-apocalyptic language referred to as trash talk, which comes across just as gruff as it does unintelligible. Guns fire with an incredible level of weight to them, while cadavers fly into each other with punchy impact. Energy beams and radiations rev with distinct power, while robotic parts crash into scrap heaps. The sounds of Nuclear Throne feel like they have the production values that can rival any big budget title, and this is something that attributes to how fantastic the game just feels to play. If you want to know more about this, I suggest checking out the Game Maker's Toolkit and their video Game Feel and Juice. It goes into heavy detail about mechanical and audiovisual nuances that make the games feel good, and it especially analyzes Lambeer's games and why they have time and time again proven to be the masters when it comes to this. When it comes to the soundtrack, chiptunes are non-existent. Instead, a large majority of it is recorded with a mixture of acoustic and electronic instruments, evoking a strong feeling of being more of a desolate, wild western wasteland. And the further into the game you get, the more desperate and painful the tunes become. Because Nuclear Throne isn't merely a glorified story of a gung-ho post-apocalyptic Wild West. It's a story of freaks, mutants, and outcasts who struggle to survive and satiate their own suffering. It's not a story of glory, it's a story of vaguely defined and selfish motivations. Even the flavor text in the loading screens have a mixture of hopelessness, musing, and determination. When you contrast the detailed pixels to the somber and intense melodies, the incredible heavy prevalence of light motifs, and the gritty sound design, the juxtaposition ends up making for some subtle ways of creating investment in the world. And this is all nailed home by one final element, which is namely the game's promotional art. A few years back, an interview was conducted with Devolver Digital and Denathan Games regarding the development and success of Hotline Miami, and in that video, one of the game's musicians, as well as its lead promotional artist, Niklas Åkerblad, had posited that the artwork he made for the video game allowed fans to be able to interpret more of the world beyond the actual pixel artwork. It was a way to give an expanded vision and to enrich the imagination of fans who were experiencing the game, and being able to leave a world partially for imagination is part of the reason sprite work like this can be compelling in its own right. Nuclear Throne's lead promotional artist is a Canadian concept artist Justin Chan, who among other things has done work for Ubisoft and Nickelodeon. He was hired to work on the game after drawing a piece of fan art in support of the initial Wasteland Kings jam, and one look at any of his pieces comes to show that this was a definitive win in bringing Nuclear Throne together as a world. It's a beautiful extension of the characters and inhabitants of the Wasteland itself, and giving these characters distinct traits that come across in the visual presentation both inside and outside of the game helps Nuclear Throne be a game that stands the test of time and creates a world I want to explore more. It extends into much of the game's mechanics. Why is Fish's ability a combat role, and how come all of his passives in Ultra have to do with skill and weaponry? Probably because before the apocalypse and his mutation, he was a cop. Why does Rebel have a unique voice clip after beating Big Bandit? Because the two of them are related and she regrets having to kill her brother. Why is Rogue the only character who gets chased by IDPD in every level? Because her active ability is a weapon she stole from her own ranks, and the reason for that is because of disillusion to them having betrayed and abandoned Little Hunter for dead, who was her friend. It's somewhat clear and fairly often joked about that Vlambeer were occasionally at odds with each other when it came to building the lore and story of Nuclear Throne, which is somewhat fair since a lot of Nuclear Throne's story is left up to interpretation, is fairly vague, and isn't that much of a focus. You won't learn a lot about the story by just playing the game itself, but because of the game's charming characters and its wonderful gameplay, it's easy to see why it's such a lovable environment to partake in and theorize about. Just what is a Nuclear Throne really? Just what is the nature of the loops and why do the characters go through with them? Why are the IDPD always out to get to you? Will Cuz ever be a playable character, and when will YV be verified? In a sense, it's almost fair to say that the fabled Nuclear Throne itself might just be analogous to a player's investment in the curious unknown. While these are things we may never know, this all draws us closer to the Nuclear Throne. Out of the many roguelikes I've played throughout the year, Nuclear Throne is the one I find myself returning to the most because it is a sensory explosion of some of indie's greatest talents coming together to provide a game that is massive in its world and gameplay. And it's humbling to think that this all started from a simple game jam. I like to think that Nuclear Throne is a prime example of an indie game that has thrived on almost every nuance and advantage there is to indie game development. From its beautiful aesthetics to its style of gameplay and the way fan feedback fueled the end product. If you're a fan of games like Binding of Isaac and Enter the Gungeon, you owe it to yourself to check out this game since it will decimate you to hell and back, and no level of RNG can save you from getting gunned down by a robot sniper from across the map. You need to micromanage your weapons, you need to plan accordingly, but while doing that, you need to think fast and on your feet, because the wasteland is relentless. But if you're hardened enough to brave it, it will welcome you with open arms.